Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Rock the Closing. Welcome, welcome. Today we will be talking about real estate transaction costs. What costs are there beyond and above the closing costs? So I just want to put in a little disclaimer to say that we are recording this at a specific date and time in space here, right? So we're recording it in January 2025. So we're going to be floating some numbers to create an understanding of these transaction costs, but please understand that every transaction is different, will have specific costs associated with it, and also, the year and just the general circumstances of the world are also going to need to be taken into account. So please do not take these numbers as a given. They're just sort of what's happening right now in this space for us. Okay. So, Orsolya, I just wanted to ask you to get started. What do you think of when we say real estate transaction costs?
Thanks, Dalia. Actually, this topic came up because not too long ago, I got a phone call from a real estate agent, and she was asking me what additional transaction costs are there that the agent's buyer has to consider. And I was starting to think about it. It's actually a really good topic for us to record at Rock the Closing because everyone is talking about closing costs, and more or less in today's world, everyone has quite a good knowledge that beyond the purchase price, there are additional costs that has to be paid by the seller and by the buyer at the time of the closing. But what nobody is talking about is that before closing, so in the period when you're thinking that you go into the fully executed contract and prior to closing, there are and there might be costs coming up that no one really talks about because those are just so naturally part of the transaction itself. And there are costs that may have to be paid by both the seller and the buyer between entering into contract, so after entering into contract and before closing. So let's look at these. Dalia, let me shoot it back to you. What could be a typical seller's cost after we go into contract? What does he has to pay for?
So that's a good question because a lot of people don't realize how often and how much the seller's cost can be. A lot of people think that when they're selling a home or a co-op or a condo, they're just kind of signing the contract, agreeing to the purchase price and waiting for closing. Not the case. Very often we are looking at title or lien reports in case of a co-op, and we have to make sure that we are staying in compliance for all the things in the title report, right? Or the lien search report. So we might see as a seller violations in that report on the property. We might see back taxes that are owed, open permits. We might see old judgments, old liens, old notices of violation. I've seen it so many times where owners just don't even know that these things exist. They don't even know that it's in their home's background, and it all has to be cleared up. It's got to be paid for, proof of receipt, proof of payment, clearance notifications from the county or the town or the city or whoever needs to provide that. So these are some really important transactional costs that a seller would definitely be incurring. A lot of times, if you are selling a home, you might have an issue with an underground oil tank. Okay, people are really concerned about that. So there's going to be costs associated with maybe providing documentation that it was properly disposed of. Maybe it needs to be removed from the property. Another issue could be if the survey is completed and you find out that you have a fence that 3 owners ago put in is out of possession. So now you need to move that fence, or you need to give a credit, or you need to figure out what needs to be done as a seller. That will likely cost money. Another cost that the seller will have before closing and after the contract is any agreements or commitments that they made to the buyer pertaining to repairs or replacements of items in the home. Okay, we already know that the plumbing has to be in working order, the electricity, the roof has to be free of leaks. So, these things might come up in an inspection as needing to be repaired. that's going to be a big cost for a seller, right? So you need to be aware of these things. A lot of times they're blindsided, okay? Appliances that are not in working order, that might have to be replaced as well. So you figure out what it is you negotiated with the buyer, and that's just some of the seller's costs, but those are kind of the big ones that really they need to be aware of. That's what I have to say about that. What do you think, Orsolya, particularly are some fees that buyers have to keep in mind during this transaction?
Right. And we know that when you are buying something, you are really, really have to be aware how much the whole transaction is going to cost you, because you're probably making the highest offer, highest bid on a house, condo, co-op apartment, and you think, okay, I have this money plus I have the closing cost, and then when I closed I have like $20 or $100 on my bank account. I have seen that so often with clients, this happening to them. So buyers, be aware that after you go into a fully executed contract, or sometimes even before, you have additional costs that I am now referring to as transactional costs. And this will be, for example, before the contract, we always advise that you bring in an inspector who is reviewing the property. So inspection is one cost. If you are purchasing a house, I am always advising my clients to invest in bringing in an architect or a structural engineer to make sure that the house is not falling apart after they are closing in a month or two. Then there might be specific inspections that are put into the contract, for example, termite inspection, often coming up with a house again, additional cost that has to be paid way before closing. Then there is, as Dalia mentioned, the title report and the lien search report. These are paid by the buyer. Survey costs. So mapping out the property, where are the fences and where are the boundaries, the meets and bounds of the property, again, is reviewed through a survey, a drawing of a map, which is happening with doing measurements on site. That's an additional cost which has to be paid before closing. Now let's think a little bit about condos and co-ops. In this case, we run a due diligence process to protect the buyer, to make sure that what he is going to purchase is going to be as is, and what he sees and what he knows about the building and the unit. So they usually, attorneys have a so-called attorney questionnaire that they are sending to the management, asking about the condition of the unit, the finances of the building, and so on and so forth. This questionnaire has significant costs associated with it sometimes. Beyond the questionnaire, attorneys like to read the so-called board minutes, because that's how they can verify the answers given by the management, by reading the board minutes. Some buildings and a growing number of buildings are charging for reading board minutes. And in some cases, although not often, there might be some costs associated with buying documents, building documents, from offering plans to financial statements to house rules and so forth. Mostly these documents are provided by the seller, but if they are not, and the seller is not in possession, or the seller is not sharing those documents, then buying all the building related documents can be adding a significant cost, especially when you know that after closing you will have $100 on your bank account. Okay, Dalia, we talked about costs, but not numbers. How about floating some numbers for our listeners? And again, can't emphasize it enough. We are in 2025. Every transaction is specific. So some numbers, Dalia, for the buyer, what would be what I just mentioned, this couple of items, what would be the cost for them?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times buyers think they're in the clear once they come up with the down payment, right? You make that deposit, send it off with the contract, and now you're just, you're going to make your final payment over at the closing table. But again, not the case. Definitely we're going to be looking at, and like you said, we're in 2025, and so there's a wide range of costs associated because we service New York, as our listeners know, but the Hamptons fees might be different than fees in, West New York or the Bronx or Western Long Island or Manhattan downtown. So every place is different. And, keep in mind that there are different vendors that charge different things, right? So an inspection, right, of the property could range anywhere from 300 to 800. I generally see like mid-range there. If you're buying a house, you definitely want to get a termite inspection. This is really important. You want to know what's going on with that house. That could run you anywhere between $75 to $300. Okay, as a buyer, if you're getting a loan, especially, you will definitely need a survey that will be required. I generally don't see those for going less than about $750. So those will start at $750 and upwards. The attorney questionnaire that you mentioned, Orsolya, that could be anything from $150 to $500, but definitely could be more. Some of these transactions, buildings are complex, to say the least. Access to board minutes. Those don't generally run too much, but somewhere between the $50 to $200 range is customary. All right. And then there are also documents like the offering plan and financial statements. Now, these are usually provided by the seller, but in some circumstances, the buyer does have to pay for them. So an offering plan can cost somewhere in the $300 range. Financial statements, $50 and up usually. Okay, so nothing too crazy there. The title searches and lien reports, okay, those could be anywhere from $350 to $600. Okay, definitely want to see how many searches have to be run. So depending on the property, if you're buying in, a certain county or a certain area, some searches won't even be relevant, but some are kind of standard for everything. So that's also got sort of its own range there. So that's some of the costs for buyers. So could you float us a couple numbers for the sellers?
So, Dalia, you talked about judgments, violations, liens. Now, I'm not even going to give numbers for these because they are going to be as much as they are stated on the paper. So let's talk about open permits, for example. Open permits are when the seller decided to add a new bathroom to the premises, applied for a permit to do so. However, it never signed off on it, meaning the city never came out to inspect that everything was done according to the plans and the bathroom is working in working order. So if that happens, that we see an open permit, then this has to be, based on the contract, always signed off by the seller before we are sitting down at the closing table. So this means cost for the seller. And I have seen close out of any permits between $5,000 to $25,000. So it can be quite hefty. Another issue is often a certificate of occupancy is required. And again, for example, I had a house where, again, the seller was doing some modifications, adding an additional room to the house, and the buyer required a certificate of occupancy. And the cost that was calculated to obtain it was $30,000. So again, this is something that you want to keep in mind. And then just let me mention that if it comes to any repairs inside the premises, be it a unit, be it a house, and you have to, for example, replace appliances, you can start low by replacement of an appliance by 400 or 500 to going very, very high up to the sky, depending what has been agreed between the parties. So this would be the seller's cost that I would foresee between the fully executed contract and prior to closing. So when are these costs paid, Dalia?
Particularly with the buyers, these costs are paid as we go during the transaction. So after the contract, but definitely before the closing, because a lot of these things need to be taken care of and handled before the closing. For instance, you're going to have to get and pay for your inspection, during the process, okay, during the transaction. This cannot wait until the closing. So a lot of things we're not going to be able to wait until the closing. Judgments, violations, liens, these things have to be addressed as we go, because we can't have all these costs and all these surprises addressed at the closing, because we really need to see, certificates of compliance or paid receipts of violations, things like that. Those have to be at the closing table. And if we're paying them at the closing table, we don't have those guarantees for either side, whoever needs that. So it is going to be done during the transaction. Okay. And it's a lot. So, it's definitely something to consider, whether you're a buyer or a seller, that you're going to have to sort of have this reserve before you get to the closing, where the bank is going to pay the rest of the purchase price, or you're going to receive the funds from the sale of the house. You're going to definitely have to make sure that you have accounted for these things, especially if you know in advance that, things are going to come up on your title, or there's issues with the house or the co-op or the condo or whatever it is. Okay. So that's basically it for that. Anything else we should be aware of, Orsolya?
Yeah, maybe just a few things to mention. But this is coming up at closing, and it rather relates or is part of the closing costs, but just wanted to call out a few items there. For example, the preparation of the transfer documents, the deed preparation, the recording of the transfer documents and the deed, which is paid by the seller, or it's between the seller and the buyer. And the cost, again, can come up to $350, $450. It varies, again, what type of company the buyer is using. There is also, for example, what people are not thinking about is if there is a lien or a mortgage on the property, in order to terminate it after you paid it fully off, there is a termination fee, and we call it the UCC free recording, which again has an associated fee, which is usually around $85 to $150. Seems to be minor, but when you are adding up everything that we have been taught, that we talked so far, then you are facing some additional significant transaction cost. Please keep in mind, every transaction is specific, so you may or may not have this cost. Costs vary, they might be lower or higher. Thank you. That's from me. Dalia, over to you.
Thank you, Orsolya. That's great information there. And we want to also remind you that we are talking today about transaction costs. In terms of closing costs, we did have another podcast about that. So please refer to a previous podcast, because that is a whole different ballgame. Closing costs are different. There are different costs associated. They're paid at a different time. And so definitely want to make sure you keep those separate and don't get them confused. All right. As for today, again, we thank you so much for listening. We appreciate all our listeners and hope the information was valuable. And we will see you again on our next episode of Rock the Closing. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Rock the Closing. This podcast is hosted by real estate attorneys who offer valuable insights. Please remember that the content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making any decisions. This podcast is copyrighted by Rock the Closing, and any reproduction, syndication, or rebroadcasting of the content requires written permission.